We'll be starting up in about 2 minutes, top of the hour. About 1 more minute, we'll be starting up. While we're waiting, someone asked, do I think we'll have highway school this year? That's my sincere hope. A lot's going to depend on the rollout of these vaccines. And we will certainly keep people updated. That's what we're planning on right now. Okay. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the New York State LTAP Center, the Cornell Local Roads Program. I want to welcome you to the first of our Topical Tuesday webinars for 2021. One of the things we realized with COVID and everybody working from home is this is actually a way for us to get information out to you that reaches people who might not reach otherwise, and also a way for us to stay in communication, to cover topics ranging from soup to nuts. So this first one's on pavement maintenance techniques. And while it's a little chilly outside, it's something we all need to be thinking about now. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is covered in our pavement maintenance workbook, which is available at the box location that you see there on screen. I will be showing that again later, and actually what through the magic of communications, it'll show up in the chat pod magically here in a couple of minutes too. Now, just a couple of brief updates on reminding folks who haven't been on a webinar in a while. We're using Zoom. Most of your settings are near the bottom. Your audio settings, if you can't hear, you might have to call in, things like that. The chat pod is disabled for you to type things in, but if we want to get information to you, we will throw that up into the chat pod. So that, for instance, is where you can download the workbook that I'm going to reference, and I'll put some highlights for that later on. If you want a paper copy of that workbook, please let us know. Just send us an email. Our email address will be on the last page of the slide deck today. We'll be asking you now and then maybe to raise your hands. That's a raise hand feature, just as an illustration. Again, it's near the bottom. If you can show me, try to raise your hand. See how many of you got one, two. Here we go. I got a few folks. Good. Perfect. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And then watch, no hands up. All the hands are going to drop now. Watch this. It's amazing, isn't it? That's actually due to Adam and Amanda that are sitting in the background helping out. And I want to make sure they get thanks for that. The Q&A pod is available, and please put your questions in. And actually, I'm going to be asking you questions during the course of the hour. Put them in there, and that's where we'll go from there. Now, in terms of professional development hours, for those of you who are engineers, would like PDHs, this hour webinar is worth one PDH here in New York State. Only the person registered. If you're on trying to share a computer, only the person registered can get the credit. Okay, I'm trying to come up with ways around that, but at the moment, I've got to go with what I've been given for rules, and only the person registered. It is counted as a course, however, which is good because half of our PDH credits here in New York have to be courses. And what will happen is we'll send you a certificate of attendance. Anybody who stays on 3/4 or more gets that. You send a certificate of attendance, and if you've got to 90%, we'll get you the PDH. Now, if you're from another state, you're calling in from out of state, welcome. Thank you for joining us. This information is pretty applicable most anywhere, with some exceptions I'll describe. But in that case, you're going to need to check with your LTAP center in your particular state. Now, we're going to concentrate today on common pavement maintenance techniques, crack repairs, patching, and wearing courses. But a lot of these things are common across the board. So, again, that's something to keep in mind. And yes, I know it's January. I was out this morning for my morning walk, and most of the snow has melted, but there's still icy spots. It's still cold, and it's certainly not really the best weather to be outside, though we'll talk about why some of you might be out even now. But soon it will get warmer, and New York State has a huge variety of weathers and conditions. There are, you know, all kind of beautiful sights around the state, and soon we'll be back in outside working on those maintenance activities. So why do we do what we do? Why are we doing all of this pavement maintenance? Well, that's obvious. We're trying to move people and goods from here to there. I mean, the first federal highway bill, the idea was get the farmer out of the mud. We have the farm to market road system, which moves goods and services, and everybody starts their first mile and their last mile on a local road. And so that's what we're trying to do. And to do that, we really need to make sure we have good drainage. We need good communications with the public, and we have to talk about safety. Okay. Now, of course, all of this is moot if we don't talk a little bit about the cost. And so everything I talk about, both in today's webinar and any of the others and other webinars that our circuit riders or other staff do, it comes down to economics to some extent. We have to keep that in mind. We have to be able to pay for everything. So what I want to do is make sure at the end of the session I answer certain questions. I'm going to ask some questions, and then again, here to show you how this Q&A pod works, I'm going to put 4 questions up. Let's see what y'all come up with for answers for me. So do you have enough money in your budget? You put a yes or no in there for me. See what you think. Do you have enough money in your budget? I got a no, a bunch of no's. Yeah. I doubt very much I'll see a yes. There might be 1 or 2, but most people are going to say no. Somebody says, I hope so. We don't talk about that in this webinar. We don't have the full spring schedule yet, but we may be talking about asset management, and part of asset management is to come up with a way to check your budget. How much can you afford to cut from the budget? Something we're all having to deal with because of COVID. State aid is likely to be down. It was down 20% last year. Hopefully it'll stay steady or go back up, but we don't know. So how much can we cut from the budget? So what do you think? How much could you cut from your budget? 0? Okay. If you don't have enough, yeah. Your budget's down 15%, Carl. Yeah, I see that. You just did 20%. Whatever they tell me. Well, hopefully we can give you some information on setting that number realistically and understanding that the first thing you should cut is not maintenance. It's the last thing you should cut. And that's something we have to deal with. Can you defer pavement maintenance? I hope you know the answer to that one. But there's actually a split on this one. There's actually a couple of questions that we could talk about a little bit there. And then one that I hope by the end of this session, you sort of understand why we think this is maybe the single most important answer to the question on maintenance and pavement preservation. What repairs should we use on this road? And I'm going to give you some practice on this at the end of the hour. So do you have enough money in your budget? Probably not. Most of us don't. We're pretty close to the bone, and it's going to be hard for us. So how much can you cut? Well, that's the question, short-term, long-term. If you're thinking short-term, it's very difficult, but that's where we tend to scramble. We need to be looking long-term to really have a better sense of what should and can we cut from the budget. And can you defer pavement maintenance? That's an easy one. No. Again, it's the last thing we should cut is pavement maintenance. And what repair? Well, we'll talk about this, but the first question I always ask, and you'll hear this more than once from me, how's the drainage? That drives a lot of the repair choices we've got. If the drainage is good, your choices are much greater. You've got to take care of the drainage first. And by the way, this is the picture we're allowed to show, giving credit to Jay Olson. It says drainage is critical for roadways, and ducts are an indicator of poor drainage. So give him the credit where credit's due. So what I want to do is talk to start briefly about repair choices, because while we're talking about pavement maintenance, we really have to look at the large range of repair choices, and this is in that pavement maintenance workbook, chapter 3. And there are different types of surfaces. On asphalt surfaces, everything from doing nothing all the way down to total reconstruction. Okay, and that should all be in your toolkit. If you don't have something in your toolkit, that's a challenge because it means you might not be able to do a proper repair in some situations. If you've got a gravel road system, there's gravel choices. We're not going to talk about gravel roads today, but we could do a webinar on gravel roads. So let's just get a sense. How many of you have a gravel road? Raise your hand if you've got gravel roads in your system. That might help us as we're setting our final schedule for the spring and summer. Just 1, 2 so far that I've seen. Okay, a couple. Okay. We know that statewide the gravel percentage has gone down. At one time it was over 50% when I first started here, but it's certainly less than that now, but it's still not insignificant. Nationwide, it's still close to 50%, especially on the local system. Okay. Now, there's a federal highway item called Everyday Counts. They're up to Everyday Count 6. The idea is to look at innovations and things that are already being done that are innovative that we need to make sure people use. And Everyday Counts is in level 6 right now. But the key is some of these innovations are things we should be doing now anyway. Pavement preservation is one that's now an Everyday Counts initiative from the last round, and it's still incredibly important. And pavement preservation, pavement repairs, pavement maintenance, we use different terms, but the idea is the same. It's cheaper to keep good roads good than anything else. Now, when we were cleaning out our offices when Lynn Irwin retired and then passed away, we found some old glass slides. Now, these slides were taken by the Bureau of Public Roads, which became the Federal Highway Administration, and eventually were used in what now we call the Highway School. We had a couple of conferences here on campus. And I'll show you what the slide looks like. This is Amanda Link was able to get a beautiful picture of this with her phone, better than I could possibly do with all kinds of times. But if you look at the back end of that train, they're doing an asphalt bound macadam in this case, it looks an awful lot like a chip seal distributor. In fact, it's the same technology. We've improved it in some cases, but in others, good technology is good technology. And we'll actually come back to chip seals. And when you see the end of the chip seals distributor, it looks a lot like this. Pavement maintenance, pavement preservation has been an issue since roads were being built, even all the way back to Roman times. So let's make sure we understand that. Now, again, in 1 hour, I can't get into too much on all of the different choices, but what I want to cover are the 3 most commonly used pavement preservation, pavement maintenance activities: crack repairs, patching, and wearing courses or surface treatments. So we're going to start with crack repairs. Just to help me out, if you would, if you use crack repairs today, raise your hand. So raise your hand if you use crack repairs today. So let's see how many of the 25 or so, or 23 of you that are on here this morning. So just about half of you, okay? Now, if you don't have crack repairs in your toolkit, you should. It's an underutilized tool. The biggest challenge is first getting a program started and then using the proper crack repair at the proper time. Now, in terms of determining the type of maintenance, we have to look at 3 things: the crack density, how many cracks are there? What's the edge look like? Is it deteriorated and broken down? And the crack width. And together, all those 3 things tell us whether we can do crack repairs and what kind of crack repairs we should be looking at doing. Now, one way you can deal with this that's actually relatively easy, crack density and crack width especially, is sort of imagine how wide all these cracks in the drawing here would be if you combined them together, okay? Actually, I'm going to change my color just because I like a brighter color here. There we go. That should be better. So imagine these are all pretty narrow cracks, but if you took all the parallel cracks and added them up, now your width, what is that width? You can actually use that as a way to sort of say, is it worth doing anything or not? It's crack density and crack width are related to each other. Edge deterioration, I'll show you some pictures on that. And so the idea here is if you've got a low crack density, 1, 2 parallel cracks, not too badly deteriorate on the edges, well, you probably don't need to do much of anything. As the edge breaks down or you get more cracks, that's where you're starting to do crack repairs. If you've got a lot of edge deterioration, you're probably going to need to patch it. And if the density is high, you're going to have to do either a surface treatment if you catch it early, or you're probably going to have to rehab it by doing a big semi-permanent patch or a box out, something of that area. And again, this is described in the pavement maintenance book. The other thing that people tend to not understand always with crack repairs is there's a difference between sealing a crack and filling a crack. A sealed crack is one where there's movement back and forth. These are working cracks, thermally moving. So this time of year when it's cold, they're relatively wide and open. As it gets into the summer, they get smaller and smaller. In this case, it's really important to prevent the intrusion of water and more importantly, the debris, because if the crack is open and debris gets into it, as it gets hot and the crack gets narrower and narrower, it squeezes and puts extra stress and actually makes the cracks worse. Okay, and of course, all that water doesn't help either. Crack filling, on the other hand, are cracks that are non-working. These are joints, reflective cracks, cracks due to age. They're not as worried about the expansion and contraction, but you still want to reduce the infiltration of water. And if possible, you can actually reinforce the adjacent pavement a little bit. Okay. Now, in 1 hour, I can't show you a lot of videos. And some of the videos we've got, I don't want to take the risk of showing them on the web because I know internet connections aren't always great. So there's an excellent video. It's in our library. You're welcome to borrow it on asphalt crack treatment. But you can imagine what causes it. Water, traffic, time. Okay? We can't do much about time. We can't do a lot about traffic, actually. So what we have to work with is dealing with the water and keeping that water away from where it's going to do harm. Okay? And in terms of when to seal versus fill, a sealing crack, remember, you're dealing with movement. So the annual movement is 1/8 inch or more. That's about the thickness of, the pen that I've got here I'm writing on the screen with, or a pencil. Okay? If it's moving that much, you probably need to seal it. You need something that's flexible. If it's not moving, you can just fill it. Okay? And you'll notice there's no point in sealing or filling until it gets at least 1/4 of an inch because it's really hard to get material into the crack. We'll talk a little bit about things you can do when they're very fine cracks. The other thing you need to think about is if you're going to seal it, spend the money to route it out or saw it out to make it wide enough to put a reservoir to give you that room for expansion. Because if you don't have enough room for expansion, your seals are going to fail. Again, we'll talk a little bit about the exceptions. So here's an example of a crack. If it's not moving, you would fill it. If it's a moving crack, you would seal it. Okay, and you can see the width is pretty good. Okay, now this is a reminder, if you're sawing versus routing, and we'll talk more about that, it's really hard to saw a line that's shaped like this one. So this is when you may need to think about routing it out if it's a working or sealed crack. Okay, so you're asking yourself, how do I decide? What I like to do is, and you can do it mentally, or you can do it with a picture. It's actually a pretty good way to do it, is just take a picture. And these days with digital cameras, you can print this pretty easily. And start drawing on here all the cracks you can see in the picture. If you can't see the crack in the picture, it's probably so fine you can't seal it anyway. Okay? And then when you're done with your picture, imagine how wide all of those cracks are. If they're less than 1/4 of an inch, you probably can't do any repair. If it's more than 3/4 to an inch in thickness, it's too wide. and you can't do a repair. You have to do something more extensive like a patch. This is actually a pretty good candidate if you get to it soon. Okay. It's already starting to show some small areas of higher deterioration near the bottom, but if you catch it now, you got a chance. Here's an example of one. Again, you take that idea, you take that picture. There's only one crack, and I'm not going to draw on it this time just because I'm just going to highlight it with a circle. Look how hard it would be to get material in there. It's really, even though it looks pretty bright, it's not wide enough. You really have a hard time getting anything into this to seal it. So this actually, you can see they tried that on the other side, reflected right back through almost immediately because it's really hard to get material down to penetrate. So be careful of that when you're going out and doing crack repairs. Now, here's a classic example of edge deterioration. And this would not be a good candidate for doing crack repairs. You'd have to do something more extensive. Because if you think about, first off, look how many lines and cracks are all parallel stuff. It'd be pretty wide. And if you look at it from the side, what you really want with a crack is nice and square. But in this case, if you were to drop down, you'd see the edge is sort of broken down a little bit. Okay? And that edge means there's actually damage all the way back to where it's flush. So if we look down here, the damage is actually probably pretty far away. So that's why you can't just do a crack repair on something like this. Now we got to start talking about what actually caused it underneath. Is it a drainage problem? Is it a frost issue? Is it a reflective crack because it widened the road improperly? And that's where your own history and knowing the site will come into play. But this is not a good candidate for crack repairs. This, on the other hand, even though it's a parking lot, is a perfect candidate for crack repairs. We actually sealed it at the highway school about 10 years ago now. That particular site lasted until they tore the parking lot up about 5 years later and built the new A&E center over at Ithaca College. But single crack, was it moving or not moving? That's an important question. And the only really good way to know that is to go out there now, see what the cracks look like when it's open, and then check it again in the summer and see if it's moving. Okay. Now, in terms of materials you can use, there's lots of them out there. There's a table in the workbook. Filling it, you just need something that's going to fill the crack up. So emulsions, asphalt cement that's been heated up, even a fiberized asphalt works pretty good. They sell a polymer modified emulsion, which actually has the advantage of a little bit of movement, so it does a little bit of sealing. And the same thing is true on the other side. Sealing, you want something that moves, but an asphalt with a little bit of rubber added to it, an asphalt rubber, can also be used as a filling. And so that's why it's highlighted like that. They can be used in both cases, even though they're primarily used either in a filling or sealing operation. And in terms of configurations, there's tons of them. So if you're just filling, you just fill it up flush, done. Because again, you have to make sure it's where you can get in there and actually fill the crack up, okay? And we'll change our pen color one more time. We'll make it a dark blue. You know, if you can't get material into the crack, it's not going to do you that much good. Now, some people like to overband like you see in the middle. That's fine. But again, if there's edge deterioration, that's why you're overbanding, because you got a breakdown right at the edge. That's not what's going to help you. It's like a Band-Aid on a big scab. And when the plow comes along and takes that off, you've lost all of your Band-Aid. So overbanding is a bit risky. I usually like to strike that right back off. So you wind up with a flush fill with just a very, very thin skim on the surface. It doesn't get pulled up by the plow. And then, of course, if you're routing a saw, you could have reservoir, which is really good because in that way, when it stretches in the winter or compresses in the summer, you've got room for that expansion back and forth, okay? And usually, in fact, for the reservoirs, we tend to go slightly low so that it doesn't bump up too much in the summer. So here's an example of why you don't just try to do too many cracks. It's not going to work. This is a bad example. And if you ride a motorcycle, this would be a bad day on a wet day like today. You would not be happy. Okay. Now, how long do these things last? Well, filling adds an extra 2 to 4 years if you get it at the right time. Okay. So you got to do it sooner than you think. You got to catch it before those secondary cracks begin to form. But you can extend the life of the surface before you have to do a recycling or an overlay or even a rehab by 2 to 4 years. That's cheap. Sealing actually gives you 3 to 5 years because you're keeping the water out. That's really key. Okay. And if you seal it with cutting or routing, that actually adds even a couple more years. So you get 5 to 7 years. So it's definitely worth looking at sealing your cracks. If you don't have it in your toolkit, you need to add it. And in terms of operations, it's pretty easy. You cut if you need to. You clean and dry it. You add the material, whatever it is, and you finish. Okay? Now, finishing is an optional thing. That's striking it off, things like that. Don't always have to do that. And then there's blotting. That's a secondary step. Finishing is the actual material. Blotting is where you add sand or toilet paper even. So let's go through those real quickly, and then we'll move to our next repair. So cutting, again, you could do it with a saw, which works great for straight cracks. But for moving cracks, a router system is usually better. Now, this isn't the router in your wood shop. It's really just some ugly teeth. They do actually have to get sharpened to an extent. They're not cutting so much as you might expect. But that's what they look like underneath. And you can do a pretty good job of really following a pretty moving, wandering kind of crack. So this is what a router looks like. And you go down and make your reservoir. This is the one I think that I see the biggest problems when I've gone around and looked at cracks with issues. It's cleaning and drying. To clean and dry, you need to use either an air compressor or heat lamps. I'll show you heat lamps in just a second. This is actually a slide that was provided to us for training classes we were going to be doing. And as you look at it, you're like, wait a second, there's something missing. What's missing on this if you're doing crack repairs and you're trying to clean and dry the crack? What's missing here? Throw it in the Q&A pod for me. See if everybody can get it. I'll give you about 10 seconds. A mask on the person working? Yeah, that's probably a good idea. A water separator. Yeah. Dust control is an issue. We'd have to worry about dust control. In rural areas, we don't tend to worry as much, but water separator. There is a device that goes on the outside of the compressor. There's an oil water separator. You don't want to be blowing water right into your crack. And we were out visiting field visit. We can still go out and do field visits now if you want us to come and look at something. That's what we think happened here. They'd actually spent the money to saw out the crack, and yet we pulled the materials, rubberized material, very expensive. We're pulling it out by hand. And we're pretty sure what happened was they had literally just blown it out with an air compressor after they did it with the saw or router. And when they did that, they actually blew water droplets right on the face. And of course, no bonding would occur. So you really need to use something like water separator, or better yet, a heat lance. They make ones that are completely handheld. I actually like the ones where they put a bar on the bottom to get the height just right. And it's a lot less effort to drag it around. People put little shoes on it to make it not so hard to carry. But it's a propane torch on a stick. So be careful with it. They are dangerous devices, but they have their place, and they really do a good job both blowing and cleaning out the crack. In terms of material installation, we could spend 20 minutes just talking about just the different types of materials, pour pots, trailers, spray bars. The key is get it into the crack. Whether you've cleaned it out or not, get it into the crack. That's what's doing the work, okay? You know, these shoes are nice, though this one needs cleaning. It only does good if it's in the crack. If it's on the surface, not doing you that much good. And that's why a lot of people recommend after you're done, you just take a wedge and blot the material. You just take a squeegee, by the way, and just make it a U. That's how they make these things. You don't need to buy a fancy one. They're not going to last super long, even if you keep them clean, okay? And when you're done, this is actually a pretty good job. This really counts as a flush fill. This is not an overband situation because you've struck off all the excess material, and you can see it's actually depressed just slightly. That's okay. You may want to go completely flush, but that's again depending on the product, and talk to the people doing it. And in terms of blotting, Yes, people have used toilet paper, though most of the time, if we need to blot it because we're worried about traffic, especially foot traffic or bicycles or pets or something, fine sand works really well. But you got to get that on there before the material breaks, just like we'll talk about with wearing courses. Now, when do we do these? Well, the weather has to be greater than 40, okay? The pavement temperature should also be about the same range, maybe even a little warmer, but sun helps you there. Humidity, this is more important than anything, not too high. If it's too high, you're going to have a hard time getting things to bond. And no chance of rain whatsoever, okay? So again, I hope you add crack repairs to your toolkit. If you're not sure, there's OGS bids on this. You can have companies do a trial for you or talk to one of your neighbors that's doing it. Try it on a couple of roadways. Add it to your toolkit. Okay. Let's now talk about patching. This is the single most common form of repairs. Okay. Because everyone pays for potholes. We know that. Okay. So why do we patch? Well, surprisingly, one of the reasons we're doing it while we're repairing a localized distress, we're actually improving the roughness, but maybe even more importantly, we're trying to protect the pavement until we can do something more extensive and repairing the pavement prior to an overlay. There is a safety issue as well, okay? Because if you don't fill the pothole, you've got a safety problem that you have to deal with. In terms of patching types, there's a semi-permanent, really a box out or an area repair, a spray patch, and demand patch, okay? Now, the semi-permanent is the one we're all familiar with. You cut the boundaries, remove the material, clean and repair the foundation, apply a tack coat just like you would for any paving operation, fill the hole with patching material, okay? The one step we don't always want to do because of time, but we should do every time is clean up the site, make sure it looks pristine when we're done, police the area. But let's go through the steps real briefly. In terms of marking the patch boundaries, people want to save a little bit of money by getting really close to the patch. Don't bother. Cut boundaries. Get away from the patch anyway. If you see cracking like you see in this photograph and you wanted to box that out, there's probably deterioration 6 inches to a foot. You just can't see it yet. So come 6 inches to a foot away and make a nice square shape. Yeah, it's a little bit more material. It's not that much more. And trying to cut some kind of weird octagonal round, that's a pain. In fact, again, another slide that was sent to us. I have no idea what they were thinking here. Let's be honest, a square shape here, even squaring it up down here. Okay, yeah, it's a little bit more asphalt, but it's a lot easier to work. And labor and time is pretty important. So make it square, get 6 inches to a foot away from the edge of the areas deteriorated, whether it's a pothole already or just alligator cracked. Remove the material carefully. Okay, now you can grind it out. They make little grinders for this. You can use a loader, but that's why sawing is so important. What you don't want to do is cut part way. Again, let me get back to a color I like. Don't try to cut part way and then pick it up with a loader, because what you can do is break it off and put some damage in beyond where you already had it before. So try to get all the way through the asphalt and be careful to not create damage. Remove the material, make a nice square edge. You may need to replace some of the foundation material. This is the time to do it and maybe even improve some drainage. And then you apply a tack coat. The tack coat is along the edges. That's its primary point, is here on the edges. But you really should probably be putting some tack coat, or in this case, prime coat, on the bottom. Technically, they're different materials. Truth be told, you can use the same material, the patch. It's not perfect, but it's really hard to do too many different things. And whether you apply it with a broom or a brush or a sprayer, make sure you get something on there. Here's a case where somebody did a nice job on the patch, but they didn't do any kind of tack coat along the edges, and you can actually see it open up a little bit. So guess where the water goes? Okay, it's a little bit low, and so it would hold water, and the water would all go right down those cracks. You've introduced water you didn't need to introduce. So seal those edges. Beforehand is actually easier than after. And then you fill the hole just like you did for paving. where you add essentially 25% extra before you roll it, and that's about a 1/4 inch per foot. For those who are familiar with that rule, works pretty well. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. And when you compact it, use something with a little more oomph. These little plate tamps do a nice job on the first inch. They look nice, but they're not providing any kind of compaction deep. So you really want to hit it with something that's going to look good, but more importantly, compact it deep. I'd rather have a little bit of ugly surface properly compacted than one that looks great, but really is not dense enough at the bottom. And so when it breaks down, it fails from the bottom. Okay. And then you clean up the site. Okay. We all are pretty familiar with this process, I hope. It's pretty important, and it's one we'll come back to in just a minute on when you should be using it. Obviously, no plants, you're not using it right now. Now, in terms of spray patching, again, I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. How many of you either have a spray patcher or rent one on a regular basis, or have a company come in and do spray patching for you? I can see at least 2 names, I hope, raise their hands. But I got 3, 4. Okay. And for those who raised your hand, how long have you had it? Can you put in the Q&A pod how long you've had, either you continually do this or how long you have owned the device? How many years have you been doing crack repairs with a spray patch? Oh, excuse me, patching with a spray patcher? 6 years. Okay, thanks, Jeff. Yeah. 1 annual renter, 3 to 5. So-so results. The key with spray patching is understanding it's just a tool in your toolkit. Okay. So as you can see, there's a couple of names there. I like spray patching. I think it's a really good idea. You've got a contract out for 5 years. Yeah, it's a good way to do it. If you don't want to own the device, try it with a contract first. Again, find a neighbor that's got one. Much like in crack repairs, start small, try it out, get good at it, and then figure out how to expand the process. Because if you got so-so results, it could possibly be due to something in the technique, or it could even be the material. There's lots of things. But the spray patching, you blow the debris from the hole. You want to get rid of any of the loose stuff, the water. Spray a tack coat. Again, that tack coat is key. Okay. You hear us talk about paving. We're always talking about tack coat. You got to bind the layers together. The nice thing is you're using the same material to bind it that you put back in the hole. So it's just turning on the asphalt, usually an emulsion. Throw in your mixture of aggregate and binder. It's self-compacting the way these things work with high velocity. Okay. It very dependent on how fussy the operator is, honestly, is in the Q&A pod. Yeah, absolutely. Technique matters. You got to take your time. And then you got to top it off with a little bit of aggregate and blot it in some cases if there's a lot of excess asphalt, depending on the mix. And you got to make sure everything is clean. At the end of the day, you got to make sure it's clean. When I worked for Yates County, we owned a spray trailer. And if you cleaned it out and took it back to the shop and made sure it was working, it worked great the next time. If you didn't, it was a pain the next time because it wasn't consistent. I walked out to a site once wearing light colored pants. There's a lot of spray. And I guess my wife won't let me wear light colored pants anymore when I go out in the job sites. I wonder why. I guess she didn't like the fact that my pants were pretty much dotted from that point on. So they make automated patching equipment. And again, in a 1-hour session, I can't go through all of it, but I can just remind you of the fact that they're trailer mounted, there's truck mounted, they're self-contained, and in the winter, self-contained units are sort of nice. But if you're going to have one, do it and do it right. And then finally, demand patching. Now, demand patching we do year round. In fact, some of you may get to do some demand patching in the next week or two as the weather warms up and down. During January thaws, we do a lot of demand patching. It is probably our most common pavement maintenance technique. Okay, it's not really pavement preservation in the classic sense because we're not really going in and preserving the pavement. We're reacting. In fact, some agencies have a 24-hour standard for patching potholes. 1-800-potholes is the number used. The state had one at one time. I have to admit, I don't know if they still got that. The idea is to restore safety and to do a little bit of taking care of some of the drainage problems. But truth be told, it's a safety issue. The underlying distress is not repaired. And of course, the problem is we're doing it in the worst possible conditions. And so I know you're doing it in lousy conditions. Nobody wants to be out there, but 1-800-pothole still works. Good to know. Thanks, Mike. Okay. So if you've got a pothole you see on a state highway, you can call 1-800-pothole and they'll report that to somebody. But do me a favor. If you're going to go out, do it right. You don't want that motto on the side of the truck. We do it nice because we do it twice. This is actually a road that I walk by when I walk to work. So something I certainly hope to start doing here soon, here in 2021. They filled this set of potholes, whatever you might call them, 3 times in one winter. 3 different agencies, because this is one of these roads that sort of is a city street, sort of is a state highway, and even the university came by once. They all did the same technique. They did throw and go. They just threw the stuff on the hole and expected traffic to compact it. Never lasted more than about 24 hours, especially if there was any kind of snow and moisture coming along. So do it right, do it once. So do throw and roll. I'm a big fan of it. You got to go in first. If you can, brush out the hole. Though truth be told, with polymers, it's not as critical. This is probably the least important step, which is irony. Very important for the others, but not so much in this case because of the polymers, but they cost more. You put your material in, roll it with the truck tire. That's the key. That's how this works. There's high pressure in the truck tires, over 100 psi, help activate the polymers, helps hold it in place. You mound it up slightly if you can, but not much. Obviously, you don't want a big bump for traffic. And voila, you have yourself a nice patch. Now, to illustrate how this works, if we were doing the full workshop, we'd actually make some cupcakes out of this. Okay. We have a video of how these cupcakes making works. We'll throw it up on the web. At the end of this session, we're going to post the video of this. And next to it, we'll post a copy of the video. We're trying to make a low-res version of it. It's high-res and takes a while to download in some cases. But here's some still pictures from the video. So first you can see, we've made the pothole patches. And in the left side, we just pressed on it with a end of a hammer. Just pressed on it slightly. Sort of the equivalent of rolling with your truck tire. Not a lot of pressure, but patch gets compacted. The right side, we just do it in, hit it with the back of our spoon, the equivalent of hitting with the back of your shovel. So we quickly flip it over, and after only about 26 seconds, you can see it's uncompacted, already starting to fall apart. 5 minutes in, haven't done anything, just watching it. It's pretty much deteriorated, and after 15 minutes, it's pretty much useless. And that's what happens if you do throw and go. You just throw the stuff in the hole, you might as well walk away and be ready to come back the next day. But if you put in the proper effort and roll it properly, you can get 80-90% of your patches surviving the entire spring. It's definitely worth doing, but again, you need to use a polymer mix and you need to roll it with a truck tire. Now, in terms of patching cost effectiveness, we got 3 choices: spray patch, throw and roll, or that box out semi-permanent. Which one do you think is the most cost effective right now in the winter? So in the Q&A, what do you think is the most cost effective? Spray, throw and roll. Obviously, we can't do semi-permanent. Surprisingly, they've done the studies, okay? And it turns out throw and roll actually is the most cost effective. But by the way, not as much as they like to make it out. Truth be told, if you've got a spray patcher and you're good at using it, keep using it. If you don't, and you've got throw and roll, use that. They both work pretty darn well. Okay, now a question in the Q&A, what's the minimum depth of a pothole to utilize throw and roll? I don't know the exact answer to that. I've seen ones as little as an inch, inch and a half. The key is to be able to activate that polymer and to have something to bond against, okay? The big key there is a lot of times when you're seeing those surface failures, it's actually a delamination of the upper layers. And while that pothole might stay, you may be losing areas around it because you've got a delamination due to a loss of tack coat or some other factor. So pretty thin. But again, it's going to come down to you got something to bond against, okay? And a good side to work against. In the summer, the most cost effective, as you might guess, is the semi-permanent patch, if done properly. But again, when you run the math, not by that much. If you've got that spray patch truck and you're using it, you've had good success with it, you can use that and be pretty darn successful. And then when do you stop using it and do the semi-permanent? Well, if it's a really big area, and you'll know that, you're probably pretty good at it. And then what I want to do is spend about 10 minutes on thin wearing courses, and we'll end with some Q&A real quick. So this is thin wearing courses. Some people just call them surface treatments. We use the term wearing courses because it really is just it's wearing the traffic that's on it. The purpose of all of these, whatever you call them, seal and protect the pavement. Okay, keep the water out. They've got to have a skid resistant surface. You're going to restore the oxidized surface from losing in the sun. And some of them can fill minor ruts. But be careful. Let's talk about that. Now, what's a good candidate? Well, a good candidate is one that looks like this after it starts to dry. So if you're walking along and the pavement as it's drying, dries real quickly, probably not a good candidate. But when it starts to get this splotchy look to it, and you can tell that it's not holding against water, it's not as impervious, perfect time to seal it before the cracks form. In terms of common wearing courses, everything from sand seals to even a thin overlay are really wearing courses. They're not providing structural strength. And a sand seal is just what you think. It's done with sand as opposed to a chip seal with chips. And people go, oh, I don't like the look. This is a sand sealed surface. Now it is a double chip, I'll admit that. It's a chip seal with a sand seal on top. But if you get up close to where the middle of the pavement is, it looks an awful lot like a hot mix. If it's done properly, it really does the job for lots of reasons, and it's a lot less expensive. But the biggest key with most seals is you got to keep the emulsion close to the distributor, okay? You got to get the stones down while the material is brown. Now, if it's a slurry seal, it comes in a big box. Everything's mixed together, so obviously it comes out brown because you're mixing everything and putting it right down. But that's the key. You got to have the rocks in the emulsion while it's still brown. So rule of thumb, if it's brown, put it down. If it's black, take it back, but it's too late. The emulsion's already down there. Slurry seals, essentially it's like a Zamboni for a pavement, where they're essentially spreading the slurry out, putting it on the surface, and that's providing the seal. Now you may have heard of microsurfacing or micropaving, okay? Essentially, it's very similar to a slurry, but they add a polymer in on top of it, and that microsurfacing, and I've seen it spelled this way and this way, they add a polymer. And the reason they had a polymer was because it was originally developed for the German Autobahn to fill minor ruts. Okay, they actually usually do that if they're really deep in two passes. One is the rut pass, and then the second is the main slurry itself. And again, I'm taking a risk. I'm showing a video. I hope it's not too bad for you. What I really want you to notice is the color. Look at that nice brown color. Should be a dark chocolate brown. That's the color you want to see. If it's black, it's too late. Okay. There's something called paver plate surface treatment. That's how it's written in the state specs. The brand name is Nova Chip. It's essentially a one stone thick surface treatment of hot mix. Now, to do that right, you got to do your crack repairs a season before, which they did here. And when you place it, it's not very thick. So you have to still do a tack coat. There is still a tack coat. There's a built-in spray bar here at the front end, right here, spraying tack coat right in front. It's a specialized tack coat. You can actually see the brown color on the pavement there, okay? Now, you can also put down a 6.3 millimeter HMA Super Pave. That's really a wearing course. It's not providing structural thickness until you get up an inch, inch and a half, or even 2 inches. Now, so when do you use these? They all seal and protect, they all improve skid resistance, and they all restore the oxidized surface. In terms of rut filling, micropaving and Nova Chip can do that 3/4 to a ½ inch, depending on how you do your operations. But remember, if the rutting is being caused by traffic, okay. But if it's actually an underlying drainage problem, don't waste your money, because then the underlying problem is still there and it's still going to rut, still going to move. Okay. This was designed for ruts due to just the traffic. What is the minimum 6.3 millimeter course thickness for a thin overlay? Good rule of thumb for any overlay, truth be told, is you want to go 3 times the thickness of the stone size. In this case, 6.3 millimeters times 3. It's about 20, 19 if you want to be precise. 25 millimeters is an inch, so you need to be almost an inch thick. Take the largest stone size, multiply it by 3. That will tell you the minimum you should be using. So if you think you're going to put a really thin overlay, you probably need to be thinking about, maybe doing a wearing course, a chip seal, a slurry seal, a sand seal. And so, yeah, 3/4 plus for the 6.3. Yep, absolutely, Mike. Nice answer. Okay. Now, I'm going to show you chip seals, but the same concepts are true for any seals, even a slurry to some extent. You need to make sure the surface is clean. So the first step is to sweep. You're then going to spray, or in the case of a slurry, put down the mixture. You're going to spread the stones. In the case of a slurry, it's mixed in immediately, but you spread your stones while it's still brown. Then you got to squish it with a roller if it's a chip seal or a sand seal. Rubber tired being better because surfaces are never that smooth. Obviously, in the case of a slurry, you don't roll it, but that's, again, the way that it's made. I'm using the word squish. You'll see why in a second. And then finally, a day or two later, not 2 or 3 weeks, you remove any excess material with a light brooming, not a heavy brooming. Okay? So it's 5 S's. Sweep, spray, spread, squish, sweep. Okay? The key is you've got to get those stones in place while the emulsion is still brown. And how long does it take for it to stop being brown, to break, as they say? Well, it depends on the emulsion type, what they've added for an additive, the weather, and even the aggregate can make a difference. Because remember, the emulsion is a mixture. It's like salad dressing. It's a mixture of oil and water in some respects, and that's why it looks brown. So the first step is it breaks into its 2 constituent components, asphalt and water. By that point, you're not going to get the bonding of the stone. Okay? It's going to take a while to cure because that water content could be anywhere from 25 to almost 50%, usually about 1/3. Well, if you got 1/3 water, it's not going to evaporate immediately. It's going to take time for it to evaporate. And so until that happens, it's still curing. So there's a break period when it breaks into its components, and then there's a cure that may take a couple of weeks. Okay? So when do we do these? Well, let's talk about the most common reasons for failure, and that should help us understand that. The most common reasons for failure, number 1, wrong weather. Okay? Number 2, improper emulsion application rate, too much or too little. Improper aggregate application rate, too much or too little. And then placing the stone too late. Okay? So let's talk about these 4. The wrong weather. I don't have any good pictures of really bad weather for chip seals, even though I've chip sealed in a snowstorm myself. I think none of us like to take a picture when we're doing it in that kind of weather. But if you got one, send it to me. I'd love to have an updated one. But if you're seeing steam coming off of the emulsion that's at about 140 degrees, it's probably a little cold. The air temperature should be greater than 50. The pavement temperature should be at least 70. Don't want to get above about 130, by the way, on the pavement. On a really hot day, you have to be careful of something called a flash set, where it breaks immediately when you put it down. So you don't want it super hot either. Humidity needs to be low. Okay? No chance of rain and not too windy. Sounds an awful lot like the weather you use for haying, doesn't it? In fact, that's a good way to think about it. If the weather's good for haying, it's probably pretty good for doing wearing courses. In fact, in the same reasons you want a couple of days of good weather after you've done the first cutting, you'd like a couple of days after you put down the wearing course for it to dry out, to some curing to occur, some evaporation to dry things out. Because if it rains the very afternoon that you put down your wearing course, you can actually lose your wearing course pretty quickly and have it wash away. That's a really bad day. We don't want that. Now, in terms of asphalt application, you want to put the right amount down. There are ways to design for this. Again, in an hour webinar, we can't really get into that too much. But a good rule of thumb is if you're seeing asphalt actually sticking up above the surface, you probably have too much. Nice roller, by the way. It's old, but it's still rubber tired. It still works. A good way to think about it is when you look down the rock distribution, you should see almost all rock with a little bit of asphalt sticking up. Because remember, a lot of that's going to actually evaporate away. It's still water. But if you're seeing a lot of it, it's too much. The stones, you need to have at least 50% and no more than about 3/4 embedment at the end of the process, but that's after curing. But much more of a concern to me, and I see this one way too often, this is my pet bugaboo almost. It's too late. You need to keep that distributor and that stone spreader, whether it's a self-contained ones on the trucks or better yet, the ones that are attached to the trucks, real close to each other. That color needs to be brown. This is actually a picture I'd only had for years in black and white. It shows a nice sort of distributor going down the roadway. And I finally got a color copy of it. And I noticed something. The emulsion is black. If it's black, it's too late. And most of those stones or sand or whatever you're putting down aren't going to stick too well. So you've got to get it down while it's still brown. And for a rapid set, that could be as little as 30 seconds. For even a medium set with the high floats, you may get a couple more minutes. But then remember, you've also got to have a little more time for it to cure out and before it breaks for traffic. So be careful of that. Now, in terms of what they look like when you're done, this is a picture from out west, Grand Tetons, if I'm not mistaken, where they've just do chip seals. This is actually just a built up of chip seals on the roadway. Okay. And if you're wondering why the extra wide stripes, it's a safety feature around the corners to keep people apart from each other because they're gawking looking at the landscape. So these days we gawk looking at something else we're holding in our hand. But this is that same one I showed you earlier. You know, they look pretty good. A good chip seal is actually, I think, one of the best pavements out there. And in terms of what else you can do, well, you can add all kinds of fun stuff. We'll see if my video plays. It didn't. There we go. They're adding fibers in this case. Poly fibers to quiz what's called a SAMI, stress absorbing membrane. They can actually go over some minor cracking. It's actually pretty cool. Okay. And you can actually see the big rolls. They opened the doors up for us when they did the demo. And you can see the fibers. So that's a chip seal, in this case a fog seal, that actually does a pretty good idea. So I really want you to think about, get ready for the spring. It's coming to do your pavement repairs, your pavement maintenance. And so what I want to do is, we got about 4 or 5 minutes. I'm going to show you some pictures. I'm not going to show you all of them. I always have a few extras to fill up the time. But I want to do some pavement repair alternatives, and here's your choice. Everything from doing nothing to total reconstruction. And in the Q&A pod, tell me what you think you would do in this particular case. Okay? And I'll pick out 3 or 4 of my favorites that I think help illustrate the things we just talked about. Okay, we're going to start with this one, which is a road that's bleeding pretty badly. The temperature of the day I took this was about 95. Okay? So what are you going to do here? Are you going to do nothing? Or are you going to do reconstruction? You know, in the Q&A, what would you do? You would do nothing. Okay? Wearing course, maybe blot it and then nothing. Okay? The danger we have when we get bleeding is one of those weird things. It's not a pavement preservation technique anymore. It's a safety concern. If it gets so dangerous where it becomes a loss of friction, we have to do something. Okay. I can tell you right now, that's one of the hardest things to fix is bleeding. Bleeding occurs when you have too much asphalt. It also occurs when you get too little asphalt and you lose your stones. Okay. But if you lose friction, you may think about a wearing course. Some people have had success actually bringing in sand that they actually roll onto it. It's a very short-term fix. You can do a wearing course, but you actually want to design to actually deal with that extra asphalt. Otherwise, it's going to flush right back through. It's really hard to fix. The longer-term fix may require you to do a recycling or at least milling off some of the surface, depending on how deep it is and where's it coming from. Is it just excess asphalt, or is there moisture coming from underneath? One way to look for this is to go out on that bleeding day and look at the pavement. If you see little bubbles on the surface, you probably actually have water from underneath pushing. And then you got to think about dealing with some drainage as well. Okay. We'll skip this one. And we're going to go to this one. Okay, here's a good one. Okay. Cracked. What are you going to be doing here? And there's your choices. You're going to patch it, an overlay possibly, patch it. Okay. Here's the key to think about. Remember, what is the drainage? In this particular case, right here, that's actually water coming out into your pavement. If you've got water coming out into your pavement, you clearly can't just overlay it, because what are you going to have a couple of years later if you try to overlay this? See if anybody gets that one. Yeah, you're going to have more holes. That's actually what they had here. This was overlaid the day after I took the photograph. Was not a good candidate for crack repairs, and it immediately became potholes within a couple of years. You really want to box that out, improve the drainage. It's just too late for an overlay, actually. A good way to think about overlays need to be placed when you could still possibly do crack repairs. In fact, a good way to do overlays is crack repair it and then add the structure. And if you so badly crack that you're going to have to, that you can't crack repair it, that asphalt overlay actually has to do all the work. And you have to assume the lower layers got no structural strength left other than acting as an aggregate. So it's too late to overlay this site. You got to box it out. Yep. Okay, I'm going to give you two more, and then we'll take end of the day. Okay. What would you do here? And again, your choices, you can see the ruts. This was fairly soon after it was paved, within weeks, literally. So you can do nothing, you got to reconstruct it. This is brand new roadway. You're going to think about reconstructing it, okay? Not really any cracks that I can see, so you're going to have to do something. Depends on the base problem. Yeah, figure out what caused it in the first place. Was it a construction issue? Did they not compact the base? Yeah, you got to have a heart-to-heart about what's going on first, okay? Depends on the traffic and what caused it. You might want to do a test pit and see what's going on. What do you think would happen if you just fill this in? Yeah, it's going to rewrite on you. So you need to think about that. In this case, you probably want to at least recycle it, take that material up, possibly check the base, and then put a new overlay back on top of it. You may not be able to afford to. I understand that. But again, sometimes the right repair and the optimum repair don't always match up. Okay, I'm going to do one more. Let's see. I think we're going to do this one here. Is this a candidate for crack repairs? Just a simple yes or no. Is this a crack repair, crack treatment, repair choice? Got a bunch of yeses. Yeah. Possibly a no. How would you decide if it's a yes or no? These are reflective cracks, by the way, if you're wondering. The joints from underneath that have reflected up through. It's the size of the crack, checking the drainage. Yeah. Are they moving? Okay, that might help you figure that out. Okay. So you might have to do a high end. It might be worth taking one of those cracks and actually doing an investigation on one of them to see if it's worth doing more repairs or not, and monitoring it a little bit and then deciding. But you got to do it pretty soon before they start to deteriorate along the edge. And again, we could do even more. Some of these are easy, like this one. I hope you know the answer to this one. It's my favorite repair. Okay. Doing nothing. Okay. So yeah, I walk through. That's how I walk home, actually. So remember to fix the cause of the distress, not the effect. That's the big thing I want you to take away. So your pavement techniques are important, but you got to do them sooner than you think. Again, if you haven't downloaded it, there's the pavement maintenance workbook. I want to thank you for joining us for the hour. We are doing these webinars on Tuesdays until we start our regular workshop schedule in the spring. So we're going to be doing topical Tuesday webinars for the rest of this month, and we'll be doing February and a little bit of March as well. We won't do them when there's another major conference going on, so we're not doing one on January 19th because the county highway superintendents have their conference this year that week. There is a social media session being done in Connecticut that Adam Howell's part of that you might be interested in if you're not able to go to the county meeting. So I want to thank you for this. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next week for Bumper Banter and Monday morning and Cost of Highway Projects next Monday, 9 o'clock. Talk to you then. Take care. Bye-bye.